So
Great.
thank you very much for this very fascinating presentation. I asked myself, from the perspective of a historian, if this global history approach that you made, this very broad global history approach with this divide between more global, more collectivist societies and more individualist societies, how you ground this kind of explanatory claim in source material. So what are the sources for you to make such claims?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a kind of academic question. So if you would like, what would be beneficial to you? Want like a list of like references?
No,
or
I just want to know how you derive the sources
Mm-hmm.
for this claim to divide the world into those two spheres, let's to say,
Yeah.
and how, for example, a more collectivist society can transform itself into another form. So
Yeah,
also how transformation can happen in this
sure. So I
context.
think the collectivist and individual society is nothing new. I mean, there's lots of scholars and academic papers that have analyzed this and have entire kind of conceptual theories of how to measure how collectivist or individualistic a society is. But I did say that we're speaking in generalities here to make it easier. The Western model of civilization, let's say the Anglo-American model, is in particular very individualistic. They view these freedoms as sacred. I've lived in these societies. I've grown up in these societies. I was educated in these societies. So I know. And again, the communist ideology, or if we're looking at, Slavic Europe, is much more inherently collectivist. That's just the way it was. That also goes back to Christianization coming relatively late at the end of the first millennium. And of course, industrialization, what happened extremely late in the case of Slovakia. It happened only thanks to communism in the 1960s. So before that, I mean, you can imagine people lived kind of off the land within their communities, bartering, trading eggs for milk, for cheese. So that inherently made them much more collectivist. But what we are seeing in the case of Czech and Slovakia and the countries of Central Europe is that they're very much kind of on the buffer zone of two civilization values. You have kind of the more Western European, more individualistic, capitalistic, democratically inspired societies. And we know that also because democracy came much, much earlier. Democracy came to us, or the modern form came to us in 1989. Before that, we had democracy for a short, kind of the interwar Czechoslovakia, those 20 years. But before that, we were part of, the empires of Europe, the four empires in Europe that existed before the collapse of the First World War. So what we're seeing, taking it back to your question, what we're seeing in these kind of buffer zone countries or in Central Europe is a transition between, or hybridity between, collectivism and individualism. If you travel more east towards Ukraine or Russia, you'll see much more explicit collectivist societies, and perhaps most exemplified in China, that has really preserved this notion, also because it is still communistic.
Okay, thank you.
May I say something?
Sure.
This is Michael Kapanik.
Hi, Michael.
Hi. I lived in communist Slovakia in 1982-83, where I was doing my doctoral dissertation research. And I remember early on somebody told me, "Dajte si pozor, steny majú uši," which means be careful, the walls have ears. And they said, everything's bugged. I was with the Studia Academica Slovakia, which is the summer school at first, and then I was on my own doing research. And I actually met some dissidents, and they didn't even tell me their last names, but they showed me some of the materials they had and how they were moving them around. But it was very careful. They didn't even want them to know who they were,
Yeah.
and I could see why.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that some people told me is that there was an informer in every building. Every building is watched, and someone else told me that they think about 1 out of every 10 persons was an informer in some way or another, which is, a very high percentage. So that's where that lack of trust came. But where people could trust others was in families or in small groups. And there you heard what people really really thought. But there is a divergence also between what intellectuals think and thought and what the average worker might think, because in the
Absolutely.
new transition from communism to democracy, there are a lot of people that say, "Oh, it was good back then. You know, we could buy milk very inexpensively. Bread was cheap and good, and you know, it cost us hardly anything to ride the bus to the train." And there was that security blanket. They didn't have to worry. You know, it's kind of security the way a child feels secure. It doesn't have to. They don't have to go out on their own. They're guaranteed a job. They don't have to work that hard, and they're always covered.
Yeah.
But you know, somebody like myself, who's an intellectual, or other people who are ambitious and want to do more, like the new system much better. And it's not perfect by any means. It's still in the process of changing and modifying and improving. But I noticed that divergence, and especially you'll see more people discontented in the investment from outside Slovakia.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of discontent. Also, we have to have compassion. I mean, a regime change and went from being, a state-controlled economy to a free enterprise economy without the human capital having the skill sets to compete in a free enterprise economy that has to compete on a global market. So there's a certain, which is why they refer to the lost generation in terms of post-communist transition countries. At the same time, because again, every coin has two sides, they refer to a golden generation, which is young people, let's say in their 30s, that are able to have extremely rapid older generation in place that's able to compete with their new globally relevant knowledge and skill set. So, even in Slovak ministries, you have relatively young people heading entire departments. So there was definitely a cost with the last generation, with inadequate benefit for our generation. But there's also great discrepancies within the regions of Slovakia. Bratislava, the capital, or Western Slovakia, has received the bulk of foreign investment. Materially, they're advancing very well and are on par with Western countries. But like Gabriela and I did when we traveled, we spoke to nearly 2,000, and the mindset was completely different. I mean, it didn't really divert that much from the mindset of, let's say, their parents or their grandparents, which they're still looking for someone to, in a sense, take care of them, because it's so hard to create a livelihood for yourself in those conditions, and because they do not have the relevant languages to compete on a global marketplace. So in a way, they're kind of losing out in this great transition process, and there is a nostalgia and a longing for communism, and these kids are hearing it from their parents and their grandparents. Istoti. That's something you constantly hear, this word istoti, istoti, istoti. And istoti means a secure job, it means secure housing, secure employment. But as we know, what's happening in the Western world, those things can no longer be taken for granted. The world has become much more dynamic, and it doesn't mean, if you have also this big push towards entrepreneurialism and towards people being able to kind of provide their own livelihoods through creating a business, through selling a product or a skill that they made with their own hands and their own concepts.
The other thing is that the peasants are much closer to the land, and they were peasants not that long ago. My mother was a poor peasant. I mean, she said she had an orange once in her life. She came to the United States when she was 16. I mean, most Slovaks only started living in cities and living a modern lifestyle after the communists came to power. I mean, and there were 60s. So,
that's when industrialization happened. That's when a new standard of living, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of electricity in homes, in terms of toilet infrastructure, in terms of education access, helping actually Slovakia in particular do quite a quantum leap in evolution. You had illiteracy and, in a way, poverty eradicated in one generation. So you had, let's say, a family of peasants, or people, in nicer terms, living kind of a more feudal agrarian lifestyle. And thanks to communism, their children were able to attend school, and not just attend crown, they were given access to higher education, and they could become, in one generation, from an illiterate parent, the child could become a doctor or a lawyer, a very educated,
there are still a lot of people there that think they're victims. That, well, of course, they look to Bratislava and say, "Oh, the money's there, the government will be there, they've had their pocket." And there's a kind of longing for that security that used to exist.
Also, there's a longing
among some young. I mean, there's the ones that travel abroad, work there, and learn new skills, like you said. But I just find there's just a totally different attitude in Eastern Slovakia than in Western Slovakia.
And that has to do, again, with the economic conditions. And I want to open it up, actually, for other people to also talk, and also Gabriela.
And this is also the way
trying to answer.
We had 30 years. Iron Curtain came down 30 years ago, so then we adopted the free market democracy very quickly. But now we had it 30 years. We are realizing that we need to make it our own. we need to make people as many people happy as we can, and the political scene reflects that. So we need to create a system within which also those people in Eastern Slovakia, they want their securities in place. We need to reflect that need in our political system and in the way we run things in Slovakia. So we can't neglect that or wish it away. We need to work with it. So how do we combine these two? How do we give people the security and the stability while still giving freedom to those who want to do things differently? And I really feel this last elections actually is becoming more obvious. It's political parties are beginning to take that on board and reflect that. So Slovakia is still changing, and we're looking how to balance and how to incorporate everyone in the decision making, and how to make sure that their needs are not ignored, because that's when nasty things happen, when people feel that their voices are not heard, when people feel misunderstood. Yes, so let's have more questions.
Frank, can you hear me? Just nod your head. Okay. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C., and lived in Czechoslovakia for a year or so, and I also lived in Slovakia for about, if you add up all the time now, it's probably about 5 years living in Slovakia. The point I'd make between the United States and Slovakia is the social welfare system in the United States is, I don't want to make this political, but I just want to say it's less than it is in what was Czechoslovakia and what is Slovakia. The easy examples are, of course, the healthcare system in the United States. I don't need to get into details. I think everyone on this, and also, say, unemployment insurance. So in the United States, generally, we're lacking, even most Western countries in these areas. And I think what that means is that you have more of a feeling of the United States, and therefore, when you're impacted by something, you're much more worried, financially and from a social standpoint. You're worried about how you're going to get through this. I think, having lived in Slovakia, people are, of course, they're also worried than they should be, but they're less worried about their healthcare situation than they are here. So, and also I was noticing, and this is a paradox in some way. I listened to a podcast recently about Sweden and how it's handling coronavirus. And Sweden, of course, has a reputation of being a social welfare state where the people are taken care of. And what I heard, and I was surprised to hear this, was that at least until a week or so ago, the Swedish health authorities have pretty much decided not to do a lot of sheltering in place or that sort of activity that's occurring throughout a lot of countries. And just a minute ago, I've been checking the world statistics, of what's happening in each country in the world as of this moment. And I noticed that the infection rates in Sweden are increasing, and the death rate there seems to be increasing. Of course, it's still relatively small, but it's increasing faster, I think, than most other countries. With that, it's just a comment. I don't necessarily need to hear a response, but I'll just put it on mute and let others chime in.
Hi, this is Janet. I'm from Maryland. And can anyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So my question or comment would be, I have relatives that are in Slovakia right now, and I have visited them back in 1990. And I understand that some of them went along with the Communist Party at the time, and others did not. Those that did not, lost their jobs because they were teachers, and they said that they wouldn't give up their belief in God. And I'm wondering if your studies looked at all into any of the factors that religion played.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. All right. So I just want to first answer to the earlier question statement and then respond to yours. So first of all, with the Sweden case, I was also reading about it this afternoon, and I think what they're taking a very kind of a natural, let's say, liberal approach, was just letting the virus spread. I don't know if they're classifying it under herd immunity. And yes, their death toll is spiking, but they actually are increasing. But they're thinking that they're near the top. They're hitting the kind of maximum threshold of that curve, and then there's going to drop off. So that's kind of the theory behind what they're trying. And I think it's very interesting that different countries and different regions of the world are trying different methodologies of how best to cope with COVID-19, so that we do kind of have a plethora of options of how to go forward. So that's beautiful, this diversity of choice and the diversity of different nations to take on to have the sovereignty to take on whatever approach they think is best for their citizenry. As per your question about God, yeah, like I said earlier in the presentation, God was a competitor. The church had a lot of influence over the people. Let's just simplify it. Communism was a belief system. If we can say religion is a belief system where you believe in God, in the story of Jesus and Mary, etc., then you have communism, which is another belief system that doesn't acknowledge God, but it believes in the greater good of the collective, in creating a new model that inverts the traditional hierarchy, where the workers and peasants finally can rule and create a more just society. So as the communists came in, and history has proven, they weren't necessarily doing it for the greater good of the people. They were just looking to take over, to come into power, then to accumulate more and more power, and then to maintain that power. And for them, religion, God was a competitor. So that's one of the reasons why they had to kind of forbid church, forbid religion, deny the freedom to pray to God, to people. So that's also why a lot of people, more religiously inclined people, defected in the beginning, particularly in the first wave when in 1948 after the coup. Does that answer your question?
So communism generally didn't, communism didn't allow diversity of opinions. So whatever they were based on, communism promised equality to all, but it was based on the idea that everyone would be the same. So there was no diversity. Linking it to the previous questions, that's why it's so beautiful and so important to see and to have a reference now how different countries are handling the situation. It reminds us that we always have an option. There is not just one approach. So that's very liberating in itself. Okay, do you have more questions?
Yeah, I have a question if you don't mind.
Yes.
My name is Evan Stefanik, and I'm calling in from Saudi Arabia. So we've talked a lot tonight about the past, and I think we all hear your warning. It's kind of saying to us, post some sentinels, a good message that's wise. Can you switch gears a little bit? And like you just mentioned a little earlier about how some positives definitely came out of the communist revolution in the east of Europe, can you talk about what a post-COVID world in Slovakia looks, changes that you might see that were beneficial?
Yeah, no, it did. Abby, do you want to take that one?
Can you start on it, and I will follow up.
Right, sure.
There's a little glitch happening.
Super tough question. Well, for me personally, what I'm experiencing during this crisis, this pandemic and this quarantine, is just a much more profound appreciation for freedom, and just how incredibly fragile it is, and how quickly can be taken away if there are kind of malevolent interests around. Of course, I'm not saying that's what's happening now in the COVID-19 pandemic, but it can easily go that way, because the quicker we give away our freedoms, the quicker we're losing actually the tools that we have to fight for ourselves, to fight for our sovereignty, to fight for kind of our right to live our lives the way we want to live, including the right to provide a livelihood for ourselves via our businesses, which are shut down and which a lot of people are suffering from. So I think it's just a much more innate appreciation of what freedom is, especially because when you have it, you kind of take it for granted and you don't see its value.
So what the situation is doing for me, I'm really growing this compassion for our ancestors, for our grandparents, for our parents, because before I was thinking, how could they not see? How did they not know that this is what was happening to them? But now living it and experiencing it on my own skin, having my own freedom limited, and being told that, we need to do this so that we are safe, and don't go out, don't go on the beach. There's this new ban in Egypt now that stops people from spending time on beaches. So don't do that because it puts others in danger. And I see all these different narratives flying around. It's very confusing. It's very confusing to work out what is genuine protection and what's already manipulation. And I'm working it out for myself. And yes, I am having a lot of compassion for those people, and that kind of heals something, I believe, in me and between the generations. and globally, because now we're experiencing it all.
Mhm.
So we can grow understanding and appreciation.
And also, there's a lot more compassion for understanding kind of the post-transition context in Slovakia, for understanding a lot of people from the older generation kind of being insecure. You know, it's like, yes, the regime toppled and a new system came in, but because they were so conditioned to living their lives in fear, they still don't kind of trust that what has come now, this democracy, this freedom, is actually going to stay. And now that we're experiencing with this incident with the COVID pandemic and being in quarantine, you know, it's like I can see, whoa, things can change very quickly. I understand now why they kept a low profile. Why like Michael, you were saying, they don't say their names, you know, when they voice their opinions, because what if the situation changes? And when it changes really quickly.
Hi, this is Cecilia Rakusek from Iowa. I'm the president and CEO of our National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library. And I would just like to close. I think this has been very good because these are the kinds of issues that we should be discussing, and I applaud you. But two things that come to mind now from both the history and now in a historical context, but as the president and CEO. But I think one thing for sure is that we have to be very vigilant and document this history, because things, as you said, Susanna, are happening too quickly. And the example that I always use, teachers didn't want to change to online education. Within a week, everybody was doing online education. So things will happen very quickly, but the key is that we document this history and we begin to plan for a new history. And the second thing is that we keep in mind the past history, so that as we rewrite, things will not be the same. I tend to be conservative, but I think 20 to 30% of the way that we were doing things before is going to change. And we need to be very cognizant of that, and in this worry about dealing with it, not do anything too quickly, but plan in a very progressive and a very thoughtful manner for the future, and make sure that we write this down for the lessons learned for the future as well as from the past. So thank you for bringing the past so that we can be better for the future as we create this new future. But I really think that it's not only Slovakia and the Czech Republic who are doing a great job medically, but I think for everyone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Actually, that beautifully kind of rounds up our discussion and gives us some kind of food for thought that we can take home to reflect upon, because we're not just living through history, but we're actually being part of the new history. We're forming the new future, and we have a choice also them out to get us, or if we're going to rise in our courage, in our bravery, but also in our integrity and our consideration for those around us, and create something better, hopefully, from all of this. So thank you so much for joining all of us. We've talked for almost an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes. So it's been a really, really an honor and a privilege to share our knowledge with you. We're so grateful. You gave us your time, your energy, and also engaged with us in this discussion. If you want more of these kind of webinars where we'll look at different aspects of Czech and Slovak history, please let us know, send us an email, and we'll see what we can do for you. So our mission as an organization is to share our region story with the world. So when we do these events, it's really an act of service and an act of also fulfilling our mission. So it really is an honor.
And it is our personal, very strong belief that this is the only way we learn as collectives, as nations, and as people. So we share each other's stories and histories and decisions made in the past, so that we can learn from one another and inform each other's decisions in order to create something new and something better. And we do have an amazing opportunity now to do that. So it was a great honor and privilege to connect with you all. And thank you for all the questions, for all the observations. And we hope to put on some other events in the future. As Susanna said, please let us know if anything comes to your mind. And we will also be sharing this video in the next few days. So you may, if you want to come back to it.